Welcome back to our live seminar about the Scottish and Welsh elections. Apologies for those technical difficulties. These are some of the perils of live television. And we can now go back to Richard, who was talking about David Williams' question, which was about the Welsh Labour Party and will Wales follow Scotland in raising taxes. Richard.
Yeah, so after we were so rudely interrupted, David's question was, will Welsh Labour welcome more powers? And what I was attempting to say is that there's actually a really interesting question as to who Welsh Labour are in these circumstances. The Welsh government, the Welsh Labour government, just a draft devolved constitution for Wales, which envisages more powers for Wales, the establishment of a distinct Welsh, or indeed a separate Welsh legal jurisdiction. So clearly they would welcome more powers. On the other hand, it's long been understood that Welsh Labour MPs are far less keen on the idea of transferring more powers to Wales. So I think there's a long-standing division within the Labour Party on this. Over the last few years, the balance has swung towards the Welsh government and towards those who favour more devolution. And that's where we are at the moment, but there's always this tension. In terms of tax powers, well, this is actually something which is being pushed quite hard by the UK government. So at the moment, we have a situation whereby so-called minor tax powers are in the process of being devolved, and then partial income tax devolution. So much less income tax devolution than is coming to Scotland very soon, but partial income tax devolution is on the statute book, but only after an affirmative vote in a referendum. Now, what the UK government has decided to do is remove the requirements for a referendum. This was something announced by George Osborne back in the autumn statement. So we will have, assuming that the new Wales Act, which is being planned by the UK government, reaches the statute book, and it's that which will contain the required wording to get rid of the referendum. Assuming that reaches the statute book, we will have partial income tax devolution in Wales, which, as I say, is not as extensive as what's on the cards for Scotland, but will nonetheless be a step change from where we are at the moment.
Thanks, Richard, for that. We move on to a question from Sandy now, Sandy Johnson, who asked about how will Scotland's share of VAT be calculated. And I know Richard wants to come in on this on VAT in Wales, but we'll perhaps start with Nicola in Scotland. VAT.
Sure. Well, the assigning of VAT was part of the Smith Commission agreement, and it has been at least partially agreed within the fiscal framework agreement. The two governments managed to in the last minute come together to agree in February. So a lot of the detail of that is still to be worked out, but the key thing is that VAT is not being devolved, it's being assigned, and it's half of the standard rate, the first 10p of the standard rate, on goods and services that are liable for VAT that are spent or on with money spent on in Scotland. So it's based on a methodology for estimating the amount of VAT that would be expected to be raised in Scotland. Precisely how that happens is yet to be agreed. Like an awful lot of other things within the fiscal framework agreement, there's agreement in principle, but the details of how it will be worked out and calculated are still to be decided.
And Richard, is there a difference in Wales with how VAT is going to work?
This is again one of the interesting differences between Wales and Scotland as we move towards fiscal devolution. We're not going to have any VAT apportionment in the Welsh context. It was discussed by the Silk Commission, and they decided that it wasn't a particularly good idea. One of the things about this, of course, is there's very little flexibility for the devolved end, because the rates can't be, in a sense, the devolved level can't really shift the rates. And there's certainly a perception here, and this, I'd be interested to hear Nicola's views on this. There's a perception here that one of the reasons it's being pushed in Scotland is to try and get the proportion of the Scottish Government's budget that it comes from devolved sources, try and get that percentage up. It doesn't really give the devolved level much real flexibility, and certainly there's been no real debate about having this in the Welsh context, even though it is a big chunk of the tax take from Wales.
No, I think that's right, and it wasn't really pushed for as part of the devolution debate here, partly due to the regulations around how variable VAT can be within a member state of the European Union. But Richard's absolutely right, it's not devolution, so the Scottish Government can't change it in any way. They will have an additional portion of their revenue, and it may well be that that was about raising the amount of revenues from Scotland that will be within the Scottish Government's budget.
And Richard, we also have a question from Gareth Davison who asks, what do you think the Welsh Greens are doing that does not appeal to the Welsh vote, and also about what has caused the downfall of the Welsh Liberal Democrats?
Yeah, we discussed this in the first of our online live seminars. One of the problems that the Welsh Greens have is that the Welsh voting system is less proportionate than the Scottish system by comparison. So, if you like, the effective threshold for getting into the Welsh Assembly is higher than the effective threshold facing parties up in Scotland. So effectively the Greens need 7 to 8% to have a hope of getting into the National Assembly, and that's been, thus far at least, too big a barrier for them to climb. Also, I mean, there have been the history of the Welsh Greens, we probably haven't got time to get into that properly, but there's quite an interesting history because they've had this slight kind of love-hate relationship with Plaid Cymru. So the first Green MP elected to the House of Commons was a joint Plaid Cymru Green candidate, Cynog Davies, way back when. But that pact, that electoral pact, broke up. And since then, I think the Welsh Greens have been really struggling to make themselves heard and to make themselves relevant in the Welsh context. We shall see, of course, what happens tomorrow. They certainly hope that they'll get into the National Assembly, but it is a big hill for them to climb, given the nature of the electoral system in Wales. On the Welsh Liberal Democrats, well, effectively it's the same story as the Scottish Liberal Democrats, the English Liberal Democrats. The moment that they went into coalition with the Conservatives, it's been very, very difficult for them in Wales. They clung on to 5 seats back in 2011. They were actually extremely fortunate in gaining some of those 5 seats by a handful of votes. And if the polling is correct, and we've got another poll out this evening, as it happens, the final poll is out this evening. But if the polling until now is correct, they're going to really struggle in the devolved election. They need 3 to form a group in the next assembly. They will do very, very well to get 3.
And thanks, Richard, for that. We move back to tax now, and we have a question from Karen Dawn who asks, will the full fiscal agreement have to be renegotiated in the future? And she says that a simple explanation of what was agreed would be really helpful. So a challenge for you, Nicola.
Sure, I'll do my best. I'll answer Karen's question, but I'm going to go back to something else that Sandy had asked for as well, which was about clarity of the distinction between income tax and national insurance. So one of the things that Sandy Johnson was asking was about how national insurance fits into that framework, because it is, after all, a form of taxation. And the Scotland Act 2016, following on from the Smith Commission agreement, will devolve income tax on earnings for everyone resident in Scotland, but not national insurance. So your national insurance, which is kind of form of taxation, will still be paid to the UK government, so still goes into the central treasury pot for spending on UK and other UK-wide and other services. So it doesn't go directly to the Scottish government. The fiscal framework agreement was the fiscal, the administrative, the political, I suppose, underpinning of the Scotland Act, and it was really crucial to the success or failure of the Scotland Act. And essentially it's because of the additional revenue-raising responsibilities and the additional spending responsibilities from the social security powers that the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament was going to have to bear, there needed to be some way to manage what happens with everything else. What happens to the block grant, and how do you adjust it to take account of those extra responsibilities on the one hand and extra revenue raising capacity on the other. So that was what the intense negotiations were about. And the agreement essentially, again, a lot of details still to be worked out, but the agreement essentially is that the block grant adjustment will be based on per capita, per head, revenues in the rest of the UK. That's what the Scottish Government wanted from the deal. The reason they wanted that from the deal is because it protects them against risks resulting from different population growth. So if the overall revenues in the UK or the rest of the UK raises more than Scotland purely as a result of a population growing faster, then that would have had or could have had a detrimental impact on Scotland, but without really the government having any capability to do anything about that. They don't control immigration policy, for example. So what they wanted was to make it a per capita based calculation, and that's what the Fiscal Framework Agreement has secured. But the question was, is it permanent, is it temporary? No, it's absolutely a temporary agreement to be reviewed further down the line after the next UK and Scottish Parliament elections in light of how it's been working so far. So there's still an awful lot of detail to be worked through, an awful lot of potential for disagreement in how things will work out and how things will be compensated for within the agreement. So watch that space in the years to come.
Alan, I think there's a really interesting contrast here with Wales. These negotiations are yet to happen for Wales, and they are going to be something that we're going to be following with great interest over the coming few months. There are some really, Nicola's given a very good summary of some of the issues that come into play, but there are additional issues from a Welsh perspective, one of which is at the moment, people in Wales believe that Wales is treated poorly by the Barnett formula. So yes. Scotland does better out of the Barnett formula than Wales, despite Wales being substantially poorer country than Scotland. Now, these complaints have been acknowledged by the UK government, and what they've said is they'll put a floor under the Barnett formula. So at the moment, the Barnett formula drives, when spending is rising, it drives towards convergence on English levels, ignoring relative need. So successive UK governments have now announced that they are accepting that the convergence has to be stopped at a certain point, but we still don't know how that will work in practice, and obviously the devil is in the detail. And the other thing that we haven't done in Wales, and this has happened in the Scottish context, is there's been no agreement how to adjust the block grant to take into account our partial income tax devolution. And certainly we as a Wales Governance Centre published a paper on tax devolution recently that shows that the different methods have very, very different outcomes in terms of how you adjust the block grant, and Wales could lose out to the tune of hundreds of millions of pounds if this isn't done properly. So this is a really big, meaty political issue with major ramifications for public spending that's going to come onto the agenda very quickly after the devolved election tomorrow.
I think one of the reasons why there was agreement reached in Scotland was because it became very clear that without agreement, the Scotland bill would not have passed. So you had that sort of hard deadline that forced a meeting of minds, and it isn't a permanent solution. The previous tax devolution also hadn't ever reached a permanent solution, only temporary fixes. So in a way, although there's agreement, they've pushed issues further down into the long grass. Can I just say something on the Barnett formula? Because the block grant will still be important. The money, the grant that's transferred from the UK government to the Scottish government to cover other areas of spending will still be really important. And what that means is that the level of that block grant will still be dependent on UK government spending decisions. So if the UK government decides to increase money in health, then that will have what's called Barnett consequentials. It will have knock-on effects for additional money coming to Scotland. In social security, new devolved powers, if the UK government continues to curtail spending on social security, continues to impose cuts, then those cuts will be transferred to the block grant as well, coming to Scotland as a result of that. So although there is an awful lot more tax raising powers within Scotland, it's still locked into a UK fiscal framework.
Okay, thank you. At that point, we'll go to Anthony to see if there are any comments or questions from Twitter.
Yes, Alan, we've got a question from Alistair Anderson concerning Scotland. He asks, if the SNP government is re-elected, is it reasonable for Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister to hold herself accountable to her pledge of closing the attainment gap on education in Scotland just within the term of one Parliament? For Wales, we have a question from Sarah George, who asks, can the Welsh Government increase training places for doctors, nurses and so forth in Wales, or are they constrained by UK government decisions on this issue? And finally, we've got a question from Michael Turner, who asks, while Westminster may be happy to give competences to the devolved nations completely and freely, to what extent might their decisions be constrained by the EU?
Okay, shall we do any of those questions, Nicola? Do you want to have a go?
I'll have a go with the first question. I think Nicola Sturgeon has set herself an incredibly ambitious and difficult target to close the attainment gap in 5 years. First of all, it's not altogether clear what that means in terms of an ambition, and that's one thing to look for, assuming the SNP are re-elected in the early days of the government. What precisely do they mean by that, and how do they intend to measure it? But closing educational inequality or removing educational inequality is an ambitious and laudable goal. Of course, we would all want to support that, but precisely how you do that over a 5-year period seems to me to be very difficult. And it's not purely about education, it's about early years, it's about preschool, it's about class inequality and income inequality. And so it can't purely be seen in terms of an educational policy, but it's a broad spectrum thing, and it's very difficult to do.
And Richard, what about Sarah's question on doctor numbers in Wales?
Yeah, and I have to apologise, I didn't hear the third question, so you're going to have to repeat that to me, Alan. But
okay.
In terms of training places, absolutely, higher education is an area where there's extensive devolution, and this is something that the Welsh Government can absolutely influence. One of the really interesting things about the Labour manifesto ahead of tomorrow's election is that the stuff on higher education in particular is very sparse, and I think one of the things which has happened in the last few years is that debate over higher education in Wales has essentially reduced itself to a debate about funding full-time undergraduate students. And so lots of other things which you would have thought would be central to the debate, for example, like the places for medical students and so on and so forth, these don't really play a role in the debate about higher education. But given that the shortages, and there's some real issues in terms of medical personnel, especially in some of the least affluent parts of Wales and some of the more rural parts of Wales, I would expect these issues to become live at some stage during the next Assembly.
Thanks, Richard. And Michael just had a quick question about any EU constraints on the Welsh Government in terms of its policy flexibility after the election.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, clearly a lot of devolved areas are areas in which the EU also plays a leading role. So agriculture, the environment, and so on and so forth. And so it is certainly part of the general policy context in which devolved governments operate, and there are undoubtedly constraints. Nicola mentioned earlier VAT. That's an area where the EU is involved, and there are therefore constraints on the flexibility at the devolved level, even if those powers are, or if those taxes are devolved from Westminster to Holyrood and eventually to Cardiff Bay.
Okay, thank you for that, Richard. We move on. Do you want to say something about that, Nicola? No. We move on then to a question from Ian McKellar, who says that there's a suggestion that Labour's troubles in England may be affecting the Welsh Party more than the Scottish one this time around. Is that because they are seen as the probable government in Wales, but an also ran in Scotland, or is there something else happening in Wales? Should we start with you, Richard, on the potential troubles for Welsh Labour, perhaps?
Yeah, I'm a little nervous about jumping in and portraying Labour's position as desperate in Wales, because one of the things that we may well see, and I wrote a piece about this over the weekend, which got published in various places, one of the things that we see in Wales is a devolved election system, which could easily see Welsh Labour lose even a quarter of its votes from 2011 and still maintain broadly its very dominant position within the Assembly. So, in a sense, quite a big switch in terms of patterns of support could have negligible effect in terms of the composition of the Labour group in the Assembly. So we shall see. We will know very soon, and you'll forgive me for not prophesying anything the day before the election. But clearly, Labour is in a very strange position in Wales. It's won 36 out of 37 of the last 37 national contests in Wales. It's been the dominant party since the First World War. Compared to its lofty heights, and it got 60% of the votes back in 1966, if I recall correctly. So it has been an absolutely dominant party. It's still, by some distance, the largest party, but, the previous untrammeled dominance is clearly being called into question, but it is being supported by the electoral system at the moment. The first past the post system for Westminster elections is very favourable indeed to Labour, and as is in fact the devolved electoral system.
And Nicola, any thoughts on the Labour Party in Scotland in relation to those points?
I mean, I think it's interesting how little I suppose Jeremy Corbyn and the UK Labour Party has engaged in this Scottish election campaign. Perhaps simply they have other troubles and things on their mind. But also, I mean, even since Corbyn became leader, he's really had very little engagement with Scotland. But Labour's problems in Scotland are big enough, and they are internal largely. They're not driven by events elsewhere in the way that they are, for example, for the Liberal Democrats. Like in Wales, the Liberal Democrats in Scotland are still carrying some of the consequences from their decision to go into coalition at the UK level. For the Labour Party, the problems were born in Scotland and ongoing. And I don't know how they'll fare tomorrow, we shall see. But they're clearly still struggling from not just the decisions within the referendum campaign, but before that. You have to go before that to the generational change within the Labour Party, their transition from a party of government to a party of opposition. And you can see the seeds of decline that were there prior to 2014, but then after 2014 referendum, you see quite a sharp drop in their level of support. And they're still trying to find their place in light of all of those events.
I just pick up on that. I mean, it's very interesting. Jeremy Corbyn hasn't visited Wales during the election campaign, and Carwyn Jones is the most senior elected Labour figure in the UK, and yet the leader of the Labour Party hasn't visited Wales during the campaign. And I think one of the reasons is that we have seen a pattern of differentiation between Welsh Labour and the Labour Party at the British level, going back actually to 2000, till the year after the first Assembly election. But there's been a real kind of turnaround. So in the first years of devolution, Welsh Labour differentiated itself from New Labour, as then was in London, Rhodri Morgan proclaiming the existence of something he called clear red water. So Welsh Labour was to the left of Tony Blair and New Labour. That's now turned on its head, and what we have is the Welsh Labour leader, Carwyn Jones, making it very clear that Welsh Labour is pro-business, and it's very obviously differentiating himself from Jeremy Corbyn, who's seen as being less pro-business. So that kind of differentiation has switched on its head from where it was in the early years of the devolution, where they were to the left. Now they're clearly towards the centre or towards the right, as compared to Jeremy Corbyn's led British Labour Party.
Thanks, Richard. And we now have a question linked to that slightly from Karen Dawn, who asks who would become the opposition party if Labour and the Conservatives gain the same number of seats in the Scottish Parliament? Nicola?
Well, they both would. It's interesting because in the campaign, Ruth Davidson's pitch essentially has been about help me become the leader of the opposition. I will take this fight to and hold the SNP government to account. She's pitching for leader of the opposition. And in the Scottish Parliament, there's no such formal role. So the party with the largest share of the votes would ordinarily have first opportunity to ask questions of the First Minister. They might get a little bit more time in debates. So sequentially, there would be a consequence if they have more seats, but they don't take on the mantle of being the official opposition, which is a very, very Westminster type way of thinking about parliamentary politics, which of course the architects of devolution had tried to get away from. There are some features in the Scottish Parliament that are a little bit similar, a little bit adversarial as well. But there's no way that you would have anything other than a split opposition. If they had exactly the same seats, then that would be an interesting conundrum for the presiding officer, whoever that may be, and it would be within the gift of the presiding officer to decide how to do that. They may look at vote share, or they may just share the privileges between them. Who knows?
Coming back to you, Richard, Derek Evanson has a question about Wales, which we've covered to some extent, which he says, to what extent will issues of education policy play into this election, which we've covered slightly on higher education. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. And then moving on to a question from Nick Hubble, he says that yes, the leader in the Western Mail advocated electoral reform in Wales and a change to the STV system. Is it possible to discuss how STV would work in comparison to simply increasing the number of AMs elected by the list vote?
Yeah, okay. On education, we shall, again, it's probably easier to answer that question in 2 days' time. Certainly it's featured in the election campaign. The Labour government has been under pressure on the record of attainment in Welsh secondary schools in particular over recent years. They've been defending themselves in quite a muscular fashion, but it's certainly an issue where they've been under pressure. We won't really know what issues have been at the forefront of people's minds as they vote until we do all the kind of post-election analysis. But certainly the Labour's opponents have tried to make it an issue in the election campaign itself. In terms of the electoral system, yes, the Western Mail did have an editorial yesterday, actually quoting an article that I'd written over the weekend, which was very critical of the present electoral system. STV has been recommended for Welsh elections, not least by the Richard Commission back in 2004. I think the thing to say about the Welsh system is it's almost certainly going to change anyway. We are almost certainly going to see a reduction in the number of Welsh MPs from the current 40 to 29. Wales is overrepresented in the House of Commons at the moment. The UK government's plan is to equalise constituency sizes. That affects the UK, Wales more than any other part of the UK. So we will reduce to 29 seats. So something has to change in terms of the devolved election system, because at the moment we use the 40 Westminster constituencies to elect 40 of the 60 Welsh Assembly members. So either they kind of have different constituency boundaries for devolved elections, or something has to shift. One of the proposals is STV. One way that you could do this if you wanted to keep the same constituency boundaries in play for Westminster and for Cardiff Bay, and there are strong arguments in favour of that. One way of doing this would be to go, for example, for 3 members being elected from each of the 29 constituencies by STV. That would be, in terms of proportionality, around the same level of proportionality as the current system, but it would have less, it would get rid of some of the more obvious problems. For example, one of the most obvious problems we have with the current electoral system is that in 3 of the 5 list areas, voting for Labour is a totally wasted vote. I mean, there is no prospect at all of Labour gaining a list AM in 3 of the 5 electoral districts in Wales, given the way that the system works. So, voting for Labour in those contexts is wasted. And actually, arguably, that kind of wastage is not sensible in an electoral system. So there are all kinds of arguments, and I suspect that this will become the hot topic in terms of debates about the future of the Welsh political system in the autumn. And then certainly if and when the number of Welsh MPs gets reduced, they will have to address the voting system for the Assembly.
And Richard, can we just check, is the voting system devolved to Wales, or is there any plan to devolve that to Wales, or is that still...
Good question, Alan. If the proposed Wales bill reaches the statute book, it will be devolved. At the moment, all of these powers are reserved. I mean, reserved is slightly anachronistic. We don't at the moment have a reserve power system for Wales, but this is controlled by Westminster. But the plan is, following in the steps of Scotland, to devolve these powers to the National Assembly. So the National Assembly will be able to rename itself as a parliament if it so wishes. It can increase or indeed reduce the numbers of Assembly members and decide how they should be elected. But that has, the Wales bill has yet to reach the statute book.
Thanks, Richard. We now going to turn to Anthony for some final questions and comments from Twitter.
Yes, Ellen, we have 2 questions from the forums. We have one question from Jonathan asking, is it possible to successfully put into practice the principle of no detriment? And we have a question from Liz asking that it seems that in both the Welsh and Scottish elections, the result could be a foregone conclusion, but if the parties which look likely to win, the SNP in Scotland or Welsh Labour in Wales, don't win, who would they be most likely to form a coalition with?
2 interesting questions to finish with. Nicola, no detriment.
Yes, really interesting. Again, this was discussed within the fiscal framework negotiations and was one of the principles of the Smith Commission report. The idea is that there should be no detriment to either government as a result purely of the decision to devolve powers. That's point 1. And that point has broadly been agreed within the fiscal framework agreement as we have it now. The much more complicated bit is the principle that there should be no detriment to either government as a result of the spending or revenue decisions of the other. And within the fiscal framework agreement, there is, let's say, a minimalist interpretation of what that would mean. Both governments are keen to not have an overly complex interpretation of what no detriment means, to not make the mechanisms overly complicated. So what they've said and what they've agreed is that if there is detriment to spending obligations or revenues as a result of people's behaviour, if people change the way they operate their taxes or the way that they seek work or whatever it is, if it's a behavioural change, then that will not be considered as no detriment within the framework of the agreement. The agreement states that no detriment will be calculated on the basis purely of automatic triggers. So if I can give you an example of that, if, let's say, the Scottish Government, with one of the new powers over social security, decided to extend entitlement to carers benefit, let's say, At the moment, the promise is to increase the amount, but if they extended the scope of that, so it took in a broader range of people, then that would have consequences for the spending of the UK government, because when you're entitled to carers benefit, you're automatically then entitled to a range of other benefits or services, many of which are reserved and controlled by the UK government. So that Scottish decision would have a spending consequence for the UK government. And the Fiscal Framework Agreement states that in that instance, the Scottish government would be liable to pay for the additional costs incurred by the UK government. Now, that's fine to agree in principle. In practice, that is fraught with difficulty. And the Fiscal Framework Agreement also says that there has to be mutual agreement on the evidence base, mutual agreement that there is in fact detriment occurring here, and if there isn't mutual agreement, nothing will happen. My hunch is that we'll have a lot of nothing will happen within that context, because it's politically incredibly difficult to implement.
Okay, Nicola, and quickly on a coalition, so the SNP don't win a majority, likely coalition partners for the SNP?
I think the likelihood is they would govern as a minority. They've done it before, they enjoyed the freedom of it, and I think that would be the most likely outcome if they don't win a majority.
And Richard, the idea of no detriment in Wales or coalitions?
On no detriment, I mean, all of these negotiations are yet to happen in the Welsh context, and that's clearly, these are all issues which we really haven't entered into in the debate, and we'll be trying to learn from the Scottish debate. In terms of the election, if I've given the impression it's a foregone conclusion, then I need to temper that. It's a kind of yes and no. Yes, it's a foregone conclusion that Labour will be the largest party. Yes, it's a foregone conclusion that the range of Labour's result is going to be narrow. The electoral system in Wales is very sticky. So, on the best possible outcome for Labour tomorrow is probably around 29 seats. 26 would be calamitous. So it's very narrow. But even within that range, it's not a foregone conclusion what the government will look like after the devolved election. So, there are two issues, one of which is at what stage do Labour decide that they really would want to govern alone as a minority government? And they've got a lot of experience of that in Wales, some good and some not so good. So my own view is around 28 is probably the threshold. So if Labour at 28 and above, they probably quite fancy governing as a minority. If it's less than that, they will be looking around for partners potentially. But then the second issue is, will anybody want to do a deal with them, and on what basis? And really the only possibilities are the Welsh Liberal Democrats, and I suspect that if they may not have enough seats to actually make that a meaningful deal, because they may well not get them over 30. The other option then is Plaid Cymru. Plaid Cymru and Labour governed together in coalition for 4 years between 2007 and 2011, the so-called One Wales coalition. They actually, I think both sides quite enjoyed that experience, but it's not clear to me what the coalition deal would look like. What would make it an attractive deal to both sides. So there are lots of, it's far from a foregone conclusion what kind of government we'll have after tomorrow's election.
Well, we look forward to finding out about many of these issues tomorrow when we get the results. My thanks to Nicola McEwen, and from Cardiff to Richard Wynne-Jones. I hope you'll keep in touch with your fellow learners throughout the night on election night using the hashtag SWVote16. Thanks to Anthony today for monitoring the Twitter, and we will be back with you next week for our final seminar when we'll be analysing the results. Until then, goodbye.